Good evening. For us, it's an important moment. That's why we have to at least respond with a sense of enthusiasm. You know, that launching a report like this one, which took years to get to, is not a small feat at all. That's why to have the chair of that think tank, Prof. Krensudin here, we're really honored to have you here, and thank you for all the work that you did. Just by way of genesis of this, I remember the first time we met about this report could have been 2012 in Cape Town, and we started thinking, how do we break the back of poverty and inequality? And today we're sitting here because of work that took at least about 6 years to formulate and then get to where we are now. I see some of the activists who are sitting here who always, troublemakers are always good in the room. So you have a couple of them. I see a couple of troublemakers in the room. MMC Van Wyk, thank you so much for also honoring our invitation. In 2015, we hosted French economist Thomas Piketty as our Nelson Mandela annual speaker, lecture speaker rather. And during his visit, we announced the foundation's involvement in what later became known as the Mandela Initiative. The Mandela Initiative was a think tank aimed at researching and advocating for strategies to overcome poverty and inequality in South Africa, and had its genesis in the Carnegie reports to understand poverty in South Africa. Then Finance Minister Trevor Manuel suggested that the work being undertaken in universities across the country should be collated and engaged with as part of a think tank offering evidence-based solutions to policymakers and researchers. Some of the foremost minds in South Africa were part of this think tank, including professors and doctors Ben Cousins, Adam Habib, Max Price, Mampela Rampela, who is one of the trustees, founding trustees of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Professor Krensudin, who I said was chair of the process, Francis Wilson, and Professor Njabulo Ndebele, who's chair of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. The thematic work we have chosen to undertake in the sphere of poverty and inequality is that of land and early childhood development. These choices of focus stemmed from a final convening of the Mandela Initiative in February 2018 in Cape Town, where interventions in these areas were chosen as critical to contributing towards breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty in South Africa. Given the importance of the question of land, both in South Africa and in other parts of the world, we believe that the opportunities of the current climate should be capitalized and the energy directed so as to be able to bring about outcomes which better the lives of South Africans. To date, we have supported and hosted dialogues and capacity building initiatives targeting different stakeholders. While the focus of much of the land discussions in South Africa has had a rural focus, we hope to broaden that discussion to urban land in coming months. There's a need to focus on transforming urban spaces so as to make them more accessible and inclusive to the poor and marginalized. The urgency for this transformation has been accelerated by high-profile land occupations transpiring across South African cities, as well as by the efforts of civil society movements and activists. For anyone living in the city, we are aware of these challenges, including urban sprawl, which has often led to inner city abandonment and decay, population and job loss, as well as the deepening of racial and class divides. Urban sprawl has in turn led to spatial isolation, and more fear has crept into our societies as communities move physically apart. Apartheid is, in its various manifestations, continues to hurt us and haunt South Africa. For many, the city cannot provide a roof over their heads and protect them from the elements. That's why for our Mandela Day initiative, since 2012, we have been partnering with Habitat for Humanity. And thus far, we have been able to build over 3,000 houses for homeless people around South Africa. This year alone, we managed to hand over 100 houses in honor of Madiba's centenary. The very idea of a home is distant to many. And you hear this when you go to visit them in their homes. And the trustees of the foundation went to visit one beneficiary of this Mandela Day program. He was a 70-odd-year-old person who has lived in this informal settlement for a long time. And Prof then asked him, but what does it mean to you that you're going to have this house? He said, finally, I can finally tell my kids that my dignity has been restored. And we forget that the heart of the work that needs to be done is to restore dignity of those who are robbed of that every day. For many more, their lives remain tenuous, and the homes that they made are vulnerable to the whims of a developer, a gangster, or security guard, red ants if you like. It is integral that we look into creating cities that house and shelter the most vulnerable, and we hope that we can continue a conversation into how we make that possible tonight. We are motivated by the words of our founder, Nelson Mandela, when he said, overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life, close quote. We sincerely hope that to play a role in realizing a more just South Africa and a more just society where all can enjoy the benefits of decent life is possible in our lifetime. I'd like to just remind us that if we are to really imagine that country that Madiba said we should always imagine, the country of our dreams, we should always be thinking of the discarded, the forgotten, the marginalized. We should bring them back into the center of every discussion that we have. Welcome to the Nelson Mandela Foundation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hatang. Now, we call these kinds of gatherings dialogues, and I know the venue does not permit us for it to be a more engaging discussion, but we're really trying to experiment and see how we can make sure that even though this is the format of the dialogues, how we can make sure that there is interaction. So we really ask indulgence on this for just a minute, whether it's the person next to you, behind you, in front of you, someone who you don't know, that's the only criteria. If you can just introduce yourself and say why you are here this evening, please. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. This was just a taster, just a reminder that we are having dinner downstairs, so we really hope for those discussions and those connections. Sometimes we can really take it for granted that, you know, coming to these dialogues is not only about hearing the people that are speaking, but it's really about, you know, sharing knowledge around the participants, which is something that's really important to us. So now we're just going to continue with the formal program. Thank you so much again for that indulgence. Without any further ado, I'm going to be inviting on the platform Professor Philip Harrison, who's going to be presenting, giving a bit of background about the sub-report of the Mandela Initiative focused on spatial inequality.
Thank you very much, Sumaya and Honourable CEO. An important element of the Nelson Mandela Initiative was the way in which it catalyzed what we hope was policy-relevant research on poverty and inequality across a whole range of fields and disciplines. It brought together research chairs funded by the NRF across institutions in a community of practice. And a number of sub-reports have been prepared. It just so happened that we were delinquent and our work was lagging. Sorry about that. But it's actually turned out well, because it means we can launch this little research report tonight together with the main report. My colleague Edgar Peterser at the University of Cape Town holds a research chair in urban policy. I have a research chair in city planning. And we're both interested in the way in which poverty and inequality plays out across space in different places at different scales, from the national, from the transnational, right down to the neighborhood. Regretfully, Edgar's on sabbatical in Berlin, can't be here. But certainly where you're born, where you live, where you work, makes a real difference to the prospects for your life. In South Africa, just as an example, you're 2 times more likely to have a higher education in Gauteng than in the Eastern Cape, 80% more likely to have access to potable water. Your household income is likely taking averages to be 3 times higher in Gauteng than in the Eastern Cape. So what does it matter if South Africa as a whole is a middle-income country, but you live in a province or a municipality that would be low income if it were a country? So spatial inequality is complex. It's the consequence of so many different factors, economic, political, governance factors. Can't go into it tonight. But it's also the cause. It's the consequence of inequalities, but it's also the cause of inequality. Because once spatial inequalities are established, they shape the access that individuals and households have to education, jobs, health services, clean water, housing, and a lot more. Spatial divisions, such as the long distances between townships and places of employment, really exacerbate poverty, forcing households, already poor households, to dig deep into their pockets to pay for transport costs. So Edgar and I really were concerned to put spatial issues onto the agenda of the NMI initiative. We didn't try, we put a proposal together, we didn't try to deal with all the dimensions of spatial inequality, but with our limited time and resources, we decided to explore a really particular element. How in the context of these spatial inequalities, people trapped in poverty, do households go about their business of meeting their basic needs, engaging in economic activities, stitching together a variety of social relations? And then how, those of us who have some influence on planning or policy, how can we support these livelihood dynamics? And the basic premise of the report is that poverty interventions are really unlikely to succeed unless they're able to engage with the fine-grained dynamics of the everyday life of poor households. Many of these dynamics are what we term informal, quite a difficult, complex concept. But to understand these dynamics, we need a much more direct engagement with these multiple forms, intersecting forms of informality. We know about informal trade. We know about informal housing. They've been quite well researched. But if we look at people's lives, healthcare is often informal. Education, mobility, religious practice, governance even, and a lot more. So we wanted to explore this in a particular site, but because places are so specific, we decided to make it multi-sited, initially to be Cape Town, Johannesburg, and somewhere in the Eastern Cape. In the end, regretfully, for reasons of resourcing, we resorted to perhaps the overstudied, although there's still a lot more to study, Cape Town and Johannesburg. We're very fortunate to have had a really great research team. Soraya Sechaba in the Western Cape. Margot Rubin led a team of researchers here. They looked at the basements of Hillbrow. You might not believe it, but there's a whole life happening under the ground in the old parking garages of Hillbrow. And we also looked at Delft, which is one of the most marginalized, poverty-stricken and violence-ridden townships on the Cape Flats. They're very, very different in many ways. And you can read the report and look at their differences. Hillbrow, an old inner-city high-rise suburb. Delft, recently established from the 1990s on the spatial periphery. But there's similarities: youthful populations, high rates of crime, drugs a major concern. But despite their difference, Soraya and Margot really helped weave a wonderful narrative of everyday life in these two worlds. Soraya told the story of how Delft was produced through state housing. So may I please tell me when my time is? 3 minutes, okay. A wonderful story about state housing, but much more important is the story of the householders, the way they've innovated, renovated, added on, filled the gaps, used different forms of makeshift funding arrangements, a variety of materials, space of improvisation, always in the making. And she went on, not only to look at physical construction, but the governance, showing, of course, there's formal governance, but the importance of the street committees, the extra-legal street committees, merged in the 80s, resurfacing in the current time, the role of religion in regulating everyday life, the role of gangs in regulating everyday life. And nothing is simple. These formal and informal types of regulation intersected, entangled with each other. Hillbrow is equally compelling. And these extraordinary basements with informal business, restaurants, entertainment, small-scale manufacturing, services such as school aftercare, churches, African traditional healers, sleeping quarters. And you might think it's informal, it's chaos, but it's not. They're highly regulated spaces, informally regulated spaces, if you like. And there are a lot of intriguing questions. How do people gain access? What forms of tenure do they have? What norms and rules of conduct exist to ensure peaceful coexistence? And again, really fascinating story. Of course, there's a degree of invisibility. They're there because they don't want to be visible, but they can't be entirely invisible because they do need to engage. Basements need lights, for example, and water. And through these case studies, I think we say something quite interesting about informality, about the different threads of informality, the dilemmas of informality, the way in which informality is in fact highly organized and managed, the intertwined relationship between the formal and the informal. But we need it to be policy relevant. And that is why, let me just end with the dilemma of informality, a considerable challenge to policymakers, planners, regulators. Local government, of course, is a regulatory authority. It has to maintain public order, health, safety in the city. Where even as we were writing, there was a collapse of a wall in Doornfontein, killing 3 children. But it's also a developmental authority that must do its very best to ensure that its citizens, including the poorest, have access to housing, livelihoods, and basic services. And the reality is that formal processes often are unable to provide this support. So there's a tough contradiction for the state. How do we engage this dilemma? ECD sector, we need childcare for people living in informal settlements in poor areas. But we also need to ensure that children are not exposed to risk. And so what the report does, and I know my time has run out, so I can just ask you to read the report. There's no easy solution. We can't provide a magic bullet. We can't tell the policymakers what they need to do. But we do try and offer some pointers and some guidance in the final chapter of how one can regulate but at the same time be supportive in that regulation, incrementally develop standards, incrementally deal with issues of enforcement, and acknowledging the differentiation. Some activities, informal activities, really are hazardous and threatening, and others are not. And we need to be able to differentiate intelligently and not just homogenize. So we hope it is policy relevant. The dilemmas remain despite our report. We know that it will be tough, but we hope that the report will have a sensitizing and supportive function. And I hope I've given you sufficient teaser to engage with the report, not just this report. There are a number of reports. I think Professor Crane will talk to some of them, a number of reports which are really interesting across many disciplines, economic, social, and other disciplines. And please engage with the main report, but also try and look at some of the detail and narrative in these sub-reports. Thank you very much, Samantha.
Thank you, Professor Harrison, and really touching on this dilemma and the role of the state, and we really hope to, in the discussion component of this evening, engage with the MMC and the other panelists on this dilemma. I'd like to now invite Professor Crane, who is the chair of the Mandela Initiative, to the stage.
Thank you very much, Samaya. The mic is somewhere here. Too much technology. So thanks very much for asking us to come here and launch this report, and thanks Selo for hosting us, and thanks Khalil over there. So Selo has already given you a sense of what this, the context of this Mandela Initiative is all about, and Phil has given you a sense already of what has come out of it. And so I have a whole page here now that I can put aside, and it's won me some time. But where this all emerges is an intense sense of frustration in the academic community. In 2012, the academic community came together in Cape Town at UCT to ask this question: why is poverty so persistent and inequality so hard to break? The meeting thankfully grew into a much larger meeting than simply academics. And the academics who were present there came to this realization that they didn't have all of the answers, and that it was necessary, this is 2012, to consolidate the knowledge base inside of South Africa about what the problems are around poverty and inequality. And so a big meeting was held of over 500 people in Cape Town, which had a lot of academics, but there were also lots of members of civil society. There were members of the political community, people from business, and so on. And it's out of that the Nelson Mandela Initiative was born. It was born as the Carnegie 3 Commission, but of course we quickly realized how politically incorrect that was. And decided that it was necessary to build an initiative which was so crucial here around the symbol of hope, which all of us have a deep sense of the significance of, and that was the figure of Mr. Mandela himself. And so the Mandela Initiative is a coming together. It's an attempt to come together, and we've tried to study this also, to study the coming together. The coming together of the best thinking in the country on the nature of the problems that we are confronted with. So what it did, colleagues, was to sit in process a multifaceted level of research around a think tank. Present in that think tank were 5 university vice-chancellors, which was really impressive. There were people from the presidency in the initiative, people from Treasury, the Minister of Health was a member. He never came to a meeting, but he was very interested. And it had the interest of many government departments, but critically there were also in that initiative a whole range of people from civil society, a whole range of people from the business community, and the labour movement was present there, and the methodology chosen to do this inquiry, to solicit this best thinking, was to initiate a community of practice around the academics, and that was one thing, but there was also simultaneously put in place a process which hopefully the Nelson Mandela Foundation will continue, of going to talk into and with communities. 40 such dialogues took place around the country, and they were really important dialogues. One of those dialogues took place in Worcester after the bombing that had happened there early in the 1990s, and it was an incredible bringing together of people who were ready to kill each other. One of the important things that came out of that particular initiative was a willingness on the part of these people to think about how they could together imagine a way forward for this benighted community of Worcester. And it's gone through immense difficulty. Even as these people have come together, you've had backtracking, and you've had people, in a sense, forgetting the significance of the commitments that they have made, and it's a stop-start process. But the critical learning about that for us was that there's no silver bullet, and this is the important point that Phil had raised with you. There's no silver bullet in the country. We're dealing with deep structural realities here, which, of course, you can pontificate about and analyze till you're blue in the face, but it's absolutely critical that we begin to look at entry points into how we might change things, even in small kinds of ways. And this was a big learning in this initiative, that agency exists in and with every single one of us. That every single one of us has the capacity to be able to go into these situations and in small ways begin to change that, to change the circumstances in which people find themselves. At the same time, while we hold politicians to account, while we talk critically and, of course, mobilize where we need to against these deep structural realities, but never to wait until the dynamic and the circumstances are such that we have a perfect a set of circumstances which allow us to go forward. So there's a lot of learning that has come out of this. And the key one is around the need for these dialogues of people with different kinds of power. So you're going to have the report. The report will be, just flash it there, please, Samaya. And please, colleagues, Paul spoke about one of the subgroups reports, but this is the main report, and it's really useful. It's useful in the sense that it points to some of the mistakes that we have made in the last 23 years. Mistakes, and I'll raise one of them, such as RDP housing. Just the way in which RDP housing, of course, we are significant in the world in that we have built more houses in the last 23 years than any other country has, proportionate to our population, than any other country has in the world. It raises this big question of the language question, and of us, and all of us here are complicit, making this decision to teach our children in English. And how critical it is that we begin to understand this cognitive trap into which we have thrown our children. And there's a lot to talk about that. And so the foundation is going to be taking on this work of ECD in these dialogues. It's absolutely critical. And so these are just two things that, there are many, many more things that are mentioned in this report, which we'd like to ask you to look at. But it's asking all of us colleagues to enter into this commitment of giving of ourselves in these dialogues to try and take the challenges and confront the challenges, and to take the situation forward in constructive kinds of ways. The Nelson Mandela Initiative has come to an end formally, but the work doesn't stop. And this work is going to be taken forward in part by the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and we in the academic community, in our research communities, have begun to think of niche ways in which each of us in our separate spaces, can be advancing the cause, of which SERI, of course, is one. So there's a lot of work ahead of us. We have made, I think, a really important step forward here through this initiative, but we all know how much more we have to do. So thank you all very much for being here, and I hope that you find this useful. And so this is formally, colleagues, the launch of this report to the South African public tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Crane. We changed the program slightly this evening, just to make sure that it's engaging as possible. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to invite our three panelists to please come forward and take their seats. Just a reminder about who is we're going to be engaging with this evening. It is the MMC for Housing in the City of Johannesburg, Mashik van Wyk, if you can please come up. Thank you so much. We then have the Director of Litigation at SERI, Nonzama Zando. And we also have Dr. Margot Rubin, who's a senior researcher at the South African Research Chair in Spatial Analysis and City Planning. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. We're going to start with provocations. Sorry, just slow on the tech side. Thank you so much. So we're going to start with provocations, and the MMC, we're going to start with you because we're really going to center a lot of our discussion around your input. So I'm going to pass the mic to you, and if we can get 10-minute provocation from you, and then we'll get maybe about 5 minutes each in response from our other panelists, and then really for the rest of the remainder of the dialogue, have a chance to engage with the panel and engage with the discussion. So I really hope that as the panelists speak this evening, that you really begin to jot down some of the questions that you have, so it's really as meaningful as possible. So over to you, MMC.
Good evening. I don't know why did I sit here. I become the first one to speak. But it's okay, it's okay. I'm the MMC of Housing. One of the things that I want to say is, I hate poverty with a passion because I grew up in a very poor environment. Three things that comes to mind, it's the inequality, poverty, and the way in which people were segregated from society. Because now I deal with housing, we have different programs that we embark on, because if you look at how the houses have been built, it's away from the workplace, it's away from transport, it's far away, and people are spending a lot of money. And because of this, it prompted us as the housing department to look at, and the planning department to look at a policy on inclusivity, so that we bring our people closer to their workplace, closer to one another, that communities, we begin to build communities instead of building segregated groups in South Africa, because that's the reality. You will not run away from that. The other one is we look at informal settlements and the conditions of people in informal settlements, and it really makes your heart sore when you go to informal settlements. I had the privilege a few months ago when I just started. Is it 6 months in my post now? To do oversight in hostels, in a whole lot of informal settlements, and you would cry. You would think that your life is tough, but people out there are really living in a poor condition, and I can say that policymakers do not make policy with the people in mind. We think for them, and we're not asking them, what do they want? And that is why we come up with the kind of houses that is built. We come up with the kind of programs that we have, because it's us that think for them. And I said to a group of people, gone are the days that we come and we tell you, we must come to ask you, how do you feel about it? We went on a strategic discussion, and there was a word when we spoke about informal settlements. What do you do with people in informal settlements? They want to get to a clinic, but they're far away from the clinic. There is a clinic, but far away. They can't get to it. Number one, they're not employed. They're unemployed. They're living in a very bad condition. And do we really take the clinic closer to them? And from the city side, we have also obviously launched 2 mobile clinics so that our people have access to healthcare, because it's really hard so how our people are living. But the rest of the stuff we'll deal with as it goes along.
Sure, I mean, I didn't want to shoot the MMC before he said anything. Unfortunately, you're being so nice this evening, MMC. Thank you so much. Look, I mean, firstly, I'm grateful for the opportunity to dream with you and to dream with you, MMC. I think the biggest issue for us is the fact that within Johannesburg, if you don't have money, you can't get anywhere lawful for you to stay. That's the first big issue. And I'm going to speak later about the city's policies, but that's the first big thing. Anyone who earns below 3,200 Rand in the city of Johannesburg can't get anywhere lawful where they can stay. That's the first problem that we have. But the second problem is that currently, fortunately for us, in the 90s, and this is probably part of Madiba's legacy, when we walked into exclusion, as a country, as a government, we recognized that exclusion, and we took steps to remove the unlawfulness. So if you look at the Joburg inner city, which is where I do a lot of my work, and where I do a lot of the fighting with the city of Joburg, many people found themselves there, unlawfully maybe, sometimes with the agreement of landlords and owners, but then they were unlawful, the law changed, yay. But then their unlawfulness was taken away by the province, by the national government, by the city, which said, we want to make sure, we want to give you ownership rights, we want to make you our tenants, we want you to form cooperatives. That's in the 90s, right? Then we're all together on this dream, we're saying no one should be unlawful. And as we speak now, we have a city of Johannesburg that speaks about illegal people. So we've gone from a government in 1995, 1996 that was saying, we don't want you to be unlawful, we want to make you lawful. We're going to make sure that we give you subsidies to buy you housing. So we have big sectional title schemes in Hillbrow that are currently occupied by poor people who are currently losing them. But they're losing them because we have a city that is leading the campaign for gentrification, that is leading the campaign for displacement. We have a city who says we want to see the buildings improve. We don't want to make sure that people have housing. That's problem number one. And for as long as a city, we are not concerned with making sure that people who are already included. Yes, they might be living in inadequate circumstances, but they are included. How do we make how do we change those circumstances? That's the first part where inclusion starts. That's the first part where justice starts. And we take the inner city, we say, everyone who's housed there, we want to make sure they have water, they have sanitation, they have electricity. Unfortunately, as the MMC is saying, to go into any of these buildings, you'll be surprised. 600 people without even one toilet. No water. There might be an illegal connection of electricity, but every month, every third month, the City of Johannesburg is there to disconnect that connection. When the people run to the city's offices to say, we want to pay for the connection, they are told, go and get the owner. If you're not the owner, we can't talk to you. Those are the challenges that residents in the inner city are facing. And unfortunately, even though we have, right now we're talking about the city has come up with one project, which is the 71 buildings prospectus. Unfortunately, again, even with that, the first place where the city starts says, we have buildings that are occupied by poor people. We want to take those buildings away, put them in private hands. So we don't have these things that say, sorry.
This is why I said we have the best CEO.
You know, and you do. I mean, we have this prospectus, but the first place where we identify buildings for the prospectus for inclusionary housing for development are buildings that are occupied by poor people. So how do you provide for poor people by taking away from poor people? You can't. Especially in instances where you look at those, I mean, I'm sure in the debate we'll talk about who is being provided for, who is being included. But unfortunately, right now, the project around the inner city of Joburg is to house the middle class, is to house students. It's not about housing half of the people who live in the inner city who earn below 3,200 a month. And that's got to be a problem. If we're going to solve inclusion, let's first make sure that people who are there remain there. Then the next step is who else are we including? And again, we must target those who earn below 3,200 rand if we're going to get anywhere.
Thank you very much to both MMC and to my colleagues. Tough act to follow, both of you. So where do we start? I think the point is, there are a couple of points that I would like to make in this conversation. The first is we need to think quite carefully about how we understand the idea of a just city, how we think about it, what it means, and what we think about this and understand the idea of inclusivity. Abidjara once said that, you know, the real challenge of a just city is to create a space in which people can dream to aspire, where they can have the capacity to aspire. And I think that that's something that we need to consider in making that into real terms. How do we make this idea of aspiration into reality? And here, how do we make the idea of reaching people's potentials into some kind of reality? Because that is the biggest crime, and I think that this is what's been mentioned already by the MMC and by my colleague, is that the issue around poverty, the issue around inequality, is that it robs people of their ability to reach their potential. And in South African cities, that is a spatialized robbing. That is a situation which has been very much categorized by a situation, which has already been mentioned, of a circumstance where the poor are pushed to the edges to a large degree, and the wealthy maintains, generally white, but very middle class. So what are the mechanisms that have been put in place and that have been thought about? Where are we at in terms of a policy? Where are we at in terms of all of the urban actors trying to contribute? And here I think we're looking at a very, very mixed bag. On the one hand, we've got an enormous amount of policy. We've got an enormous amount of housing policy. It's huge. I mean, going through the housing code can take you your entire lifetime if you have the energy for it. But it is complicated and it is dense. And it's not very well practiced, to be honest. Okay. So we have huge policy, but much of it is not implemented. The informal settlement upgrading policy, which is supposed to basically accommodate people in situ, to allow people to have access to the city, to allow people to have access to all of their rights, to realize the right to the city, that we've not seen very much of it in action, unfortunately. What we've seen again and again is this perpetration of RDP, BNG units on the edges of the city, which a huge achievement, no one can take away, and there's no question that they have provided enormous amounts of housing for a large number of people. But it's not enough. And now what we start to see is there's been a shift, there's been a change in the way of thinking around how we include people. We're finally getting to a point where we had a Corridors of Freedom project which looked toward changing the city, stitching the city back together. We've now got an inclusionary housing policy. We're beginning to see changes. But I'm going to put out this challenge. I would argue that it's simply not enough. If we're really going to achieve a just city, an inclusive housing environment, inclusionary housing, well, what can it produce? Something like 8,000, 9,000 units a year in the whole of Joburg? Sorry, the whole of Gauteng. This is not a lot of units when we start to think about what it can do in Johannesburg. What we need to think about are more activities that can create more inclusion. So we need to think about inclusionary development. We need to think about how we tax land that hasn't been used. We need to think about all kinds of different options which really push toward an inclusionary kind of city and an inclusionary kind of project. So we can talk more about how that might work and what that might look like, and I think that will be part of the debate. But I put this out. Simply at the moment, we are not doing enough.
So thank you so much all for your contributions. So what we're going to do, I'm going to have just a very brief discussion with the panelists, give the MMC an opportunity to respond, and then we'll open it up. And just to say, we do acknowledge that everyone comes here with a different background, and so, maybe some people are a bit more familiar with the technical issues and the technical policies more than others. And so I would maybe just ask the panelists as well as the audience members that if we can just let's go all along with this journey, all of us together. And so if you, in your question and your response, if you think there's a need to talk about this, explain some of these technical aspects, if we can still do that, please do that. And I'll just hand over to the MMC to really respond to some of the things raised.
I just want to respond to Siri. You see, I choose my words because there's a ring. You heard she says he's always fighting with me. I don't know about it. But we're not fighting, we're colleagues. And I admire the work that they do. The inclusionary housing policy that we've come up with now, we basically, it basically forces developers to begin to build different housing typologies that will cater for the poor. We are saying that you need to cater for 800 Rand and upwards, so that people that earn less, that earn 2,000 Rand and less, are accommodated within the city. The buildings within the inner city, the same. I mean, we know that people earn 2,000 and less. And I remember the mayor made a statement to say that when we give you a building, make sure that you build a building that will accommodate the poorest of the poor. We will not allow you to build if you exploit our people, because we are here to look after the poor. I mean, it is quite clear. As politicians, we go out there and we say to the community, this is what we will do for you. And gone are the days where politicians really, I'm not saying people are lying, but people are saying politicians are lying. But it is important to understand that we've got to look at the needs of our community. And therefore, even the buildings in the inner city will cater for the people that earn less than 2,500. That is sure.
I just have a follow-up, a question for Nzambo. So, you hear the MMC speaking about, you being colleagues, and he is fairly new in the portfolio, which is really great in that it offers a lot of opportunity and opportunities that come with that. And so I suppose, I don't want to personalize this just to make this about the MMC. So I'll ask a bit more of a general question, which is, we sometimes think about civil society as being necessarily in opposition to the state. And so my question to you is, from civil society, from your perspective, what do you need, and what does SERI need? What does civil society need to have a bit more of a collaborative relationship with the state? What do you think the state needs to do? But then also in terms of a self-reflection, what do you think civil society can do to make sure that there's a lot more collaboration, or when you talk about positive negotiation and so forth?
Sure. So I think SERI stands in a very difficult position because we litigate apart from produce research and advocacy. But as part of our research and advocacy, we have, as SERI, developed an evidence base to help the city engage with the issues and the challenges that they're facing. So at times, there has been space where we have sat around our table to say, how can we resolve these issues? But the challenge mainly becomes the fact that we get stuck. So when we talk about the inner city specifically, the City of Johannesburg, in the last 3 administrations, last 3 administrations has made a decision that says no one will address the inner city housing crisis except private developers. So when it was Masondo, that was seen to be the solution. When it was Parks, that was seen to be the solution. And now, under Mayor Mashaba, we still have the very same issue. And the question then becomes, are they not learning? Did Parks' administration not learn from Mayor Masondo? Did Mayor administration not learn? I'm sorry. Did they not learn from the previous administration? So there is sort of, at times, a stubbornness from state officials. But at the same, for instance, when you look at, we produced Minding the Gap at SABC in 2014, that research report was used to draft policies the city has adopted, like iChip. But at the end of the day, we come back to an issue of implementation, and we still have them ignoring. So the MMC is now saying we'll provide people who earn below 2.5. But this 71 buildings prospectus is clear that what the rental will be is a minimum of 900 Rand plus utilities. That's about 1,200 Rand a month. So if you earn 2,500 Rand, you can't spend half your income on accommodation if you're going to survive. So it is at times, there's no translatability between NGOs and the state. But I mean, I sort of feel like from in 2014, 2015, there was a recognition, especially from the City of Joburg, to say, we know we can't keep making the same mistakes. And that's why they commissioned some of those research reports. So there has been times when engagement has resulted, even if it's just a recognition, but we then need to see action. And SERI, we don't just represent our own views. We represent communities. We represent people who live in the inner city. As SERI, we represent thousands of people who live in the inner city right now who are living without those services. So at the end of the day, I won't say I'll be nice to the MMC, I'll be nice to Mayor Mashaba, because at the end of the day, I must account to Mrs. Ladla and say, Mrs. Ladla, the reason you don't have water and services is because of this, and what can I do as your lawyer about that?
So, Dr. Mango, I mean, a question for you is that, Nzama raises issues like the role of the private sector. I mean, do you think there's been a reliance on the state too much on the private sector when it comes to housing and, this inclusive development that you speak about?
I think that there's been a reliance on the wrong part of the private sector to a large degree. Because if one were to think about it, the way that people house themselves as small-scale landlords in backyards, accommodation, that's private sector. That's a private sector as well. I mean, I think what we tend to do is we tend to think of the private sector as these big companies. It's the Calgros, it's the Brawls, it's all of those guys. But actually, the private sector is a whole bunch of residents who have taken control of a building and are running it relatively well, given the circumstances. So I think that what we have is twofold. On the one hand, there has been a focus, particularly in the inner city in terms of the bad buildings program, the inner city property scheme, and so on and so forth, on large developers and on private developers to take control of these buildings and to try and turn them into some kind of accommodation without recognizing the role that residents and small-scale private sector are actually having in this market and the huge contribution that they're making to very low-income accommodation. So I think it's about emphasis, to my mind. And you can call them civil society, you can call them private sector. To my mind, they all are one and the same thing in many ways.
So I'm going to open it up for a round of questions from the audience. I see lots of hands. This is really great. So I'm going to take 4 questions at a time. My only ask is that if you can please introduce yourself and say if you have a comment or a question. It'll just be easier for us to follow. I'm going to take 1, 2, 3, 4. So please remember your numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry, 2. So, sorry, 1, 2. Sorry, apologies. 3, 4. Are we okay? 3, 4. Yes. Okay. So let's all get on the same page. So number 1 at the back, number 2 in front, number 3 and number 4. So right at the back.
Hi, I'm Simon Mason. I'm doing an action research PhD at WITS, and developing rent-to-buy affordable housing in the eastern gateway of the inner city. I'm glad that there was a little bit of a shift of focus to the private sector towards the end of that discussion. I'd just like to shift the gaze even more to the private sector, and I would want to ask Nonzamo, the number of clients that are evicted by the private sector as opposed to the COJ or that are under eviction order, what would you say the proportion is? I mean, if it's a dialogue, I would love a response, and I don't know if that's possible.
So at this point within the university, there are no evictions brought by the City of Johannesburg. Zero.
Zero evictions brought by...
They are being brought by the private sector.
Thank you. So 0 evictions brought by the City of Joburg. And I also want to ask then, so now I'm just going to spell out a scenario. A private developer comes in and the building is bought for R1. That building is fully occupied. He succeeds in getting an eviction order, and inevitably it's a white he. And that eviction order is served. The tenants now, or the occupants now need to be, that are going to be rendered homeless, now need to be provided with alternative accommodation. That alternative accommodation is provided by the city. Okay, is that fair? Scenario 2, private developer has left his building for the last 10 years without any security, completely deteriorating. Now, private developer wants to actually make a big profit because great profit, I mean, the margins have gone up, property prices have gone up extremely, decides to evict, gets an eviction order. Whose responsibility is it to provide alternative accommodation for those residents?
Okay,
the city, is that fair? Thank you.
Thanks so much. So Simon said a bit of a bad president about taking my round of questions. So if possible, so let's do a round, let's finish the round, and then we'll have our panelists respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Mtanda Zondlovu. I'm with Oxfam, South Africa. Comrade MMC, you do say that you, I think, almost 3 to 6 months in job now. I mean, if you're working in a typical company, you would have finished your probation. I mean, once again, congratulations to the Nelson Mandela for producing such evidence. There is this piece of land between Kelvin, Marlborough, and Alexander. It's over 290 hectares of land, which is owned by Wits University. It was donated around 1905. Would it be at your consideration, cooperatively working with the provincial government, to expropriate that land and give it to the poor people in Alexandra for housing and other urban livelihoods as a practical solution?
Thank you. Sia?
My name is Siyabonga Mahlangu. I'm from Inner City Federation. I'm working closer with Siri and City of Johannesburg. I've got few questions to 2 people. MMC.
If we can just keep it maybe to 1 each for now, and then...
Okay, I just want to ask this thing of 71 building issue. Actually, it's not an issue, it's a plan. Is that a legit plan? If it's a legit plan, why the City of Johannesburg, they are forcing the residents who are residing to the building to give the access to the city of Johannesburg in a way by the city? They are threatening the resident by bringing the JMPD to gain the access if the plan is legit. Number 2, which comes first when we're having the plan? It's consulting the residents or is to implement? Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you to all the speakers. Excellent comments from everybody. So my question is actually more addressed to the panel as a whole, but I'm very interested in what, also having the same problem with this, I'm very interested in this problem of the private developer developing social housing or developing affordable housing, because the objective of a private developer is actually to make a profit. So that is their objective, and I'm not going to criticize them for that. That's what they're there for. If you go to Rosebank Mall, it was already a very nice mall. Today I went there, it's like Dubai. It's like they're making it like Dubai. So I just said, my God, how much money are they spending to make a perfectly nice mall into Dubai? They're putting that money there because they expect to get a profit back from it. So I would like to hear why it's a problem to have a private developer do social housing, and I think this lady can tell us, because last 3 administrations have been doing it, not happening. Also, City of Joburg, look how you embrace those gentrified areas of inner city, like Maboneng. Maboneng is your poster child. Frankly, Maboneng is causing so much displacement for people in Doornfontein and Jeppiestown. And those are people who cannot afford to be moved from the city. So I think that we have to really think carefully about this when we're gentrifying on one hand, but then saying that we're going to produce social housing on the other hand. And I think that Margot's idea of expanding the idea of the private sector, maybe that's your inclusionary development, that's a very clever idea. Like, imagine if people who do backyard housing, they got subsidies from the government, they could give cheaper backyard housing. I think that'd be fantastic. You can give me a job, I'll give you more. Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much. I said use tonight for social capital development. That's not quite what I meant. But thanks so much. I'll start with you.
Let me respond to the colleague. Consultation is important. It is definitely important. You can't. It's on. But I have an inbuilt mic also. So consultation is important. I believe there is ongoing discussions that are held with people in the inner city. We have a company, and I also link up with the question of my brother about the expropriation of land. We have a company called JPC that has been mandated to deal with all land within the city that deals with the negotiations, the selling of land, and those kind of things. If they obviously make suggestions, and the first thing that they do is come to housing to find out, do we have plans with a specific land? If we don't have plans, then obviously they will deal with it and maybe put it on the market. But if we have plans, they will not. But JPC is the correct department to talk to about all the land within the city. I will not be able to tell you I can expropriate a specific piece of land because they are mandated to do that. At this stage, I will not be able to tell you.
Sorry, just while we do have you speaking, there was a question, Siad, he raised a very specific question about, how exactly does this consultation happen in the inner city? Maybe there was a previous way of doing it that he maybe has experience around and may potentially a negative experience around. Is there anything you maybe perhaps planning to do differently, as you move forward?
As I said, because the program is run by JPC, there is an MD called Helen Boertes, and they've been running with this program with regards to the inner city, and they're doing all the consultations, and I will not be able to give you 100% feedback on that.
So maybe I'll start there because I can give some of the context. So SERI acts for a community from MBV Phase 1, where they were given the accommodation because of a constitutional court order in 2008. So that community has been there since 2009, and they have leases with the City of Johannesburg. But that building is one of the buildings in the prospectus. Developers have gone to check what's happening in the building. The community has never been consulted. Currently, the building, it's 2 buildings in one, houses about 700 households. And it's rented, one section is rented out by Joshco, so the city is managing it. So there's two pieces of that. So it is, of course, frightening to think that you could be living in your home and hear that your home could be on a long-term lease to a private developer who will evict you, Simon, unlike the City of Johannesburg. That's a problem, and that's a challenge. But now to just address Simon, I understand your position to say the City of Johannesburg has all these obligations, while the private owner who sells it for R1 has no obligations. But the challenge that I have is this. In the last 6 years, the City of Johannesburg has provided housing for 3 communities. In the last 6 years. We've had eviction cases starting back from 2007 that haven't been attended to. We have even had litigation about the city must produce a plan. Where is the plan? What are you doing about inner city housing? And how are you going to address these evictees? There is no plan. in the engagement that we've had with you, for instance, in this issue of expropriation, has been raised to say, don't deal with the eviction. Rather expropriate that land and upgrade it as it is. Then you don't have the obligation. But that has not been done. Instead, the city has been leading the cause for evictions. The city has been leading the cause. I mean, I wouldn't be fair if I didn't speak about Fatty's mentions, and you know about it, Simon. That file in the city's planning department is this high. But the community for 10 years kept going back and forth to the city to say, we now don't have water, can you please help us? We can't collect levies. That is a building that's part of the Mandela legacy, that people were given prime land next to the FNB headquarters. And instead of the city intervening to make sure those people keep that prime land, they were quite happy to actually say, private developers, come take it. And so unfortunately, the fact that the city sits with the problem that it does now because it decided to do nothing for over 10 years. And those are the consequences of that. But I want to be clear to say, the inclusionary policy is right, to say private developers must contribute. It doesn't mean that they only contribute by waiting. So some of them have been waiting for 11 years. They bought eviction applications in 2007, 2008. They've waited, but they must contribute financially. And the inclusionary policy is a good place to start. But that also means that, again, who is your target? Who are you including? Include the correct people. Include half of the people who live in the city who earn below 3.2. Include the 64% of South Africans who earn below 3.2.
Thanks very much for those questions. I'm just going to respond to one of the issues that was raised, or two of the issues that was raised. The one, of course, is a question around private sector developers. Sorry, as you can see, there's a theme going on. And whether they can supply affordable accommodation or not, and whether there's something problematic about that. And I don't necessarily think so. I mean, private developers come in all shapes and sizes. We get the absolute exploitative, well, I can't say that word live on air, probably, kind of people who are only in it to drive profit and to exploit. But we also know that there are a whole bunch of really interesting private sector developers who are looking at something that one might consider a kind of philanthropic kind of capitalism, and are looking at ways of going deep down into the market, or are looking at ways of really trying to ensure that they're able to supply proper rental accommodation. It's problematic, and one of the reasons why it's problematic is a long conversation that's been had, I'm afraid, again, with the City of Johannesburg, and I'm not trying to target them, but you know, it has been for a long time, this question of ratings, this question of services, the question of subsidization of services, the one-to-one ratio that goes on between rental and how much people are paying for services, which means that, yes, you can have 900 Rand rental, but before you've finished, as Nomzamo has mentioned, you're paying another 300 or 400 Rand for services, which means it's completely unaffordable for very, very low-income people. And this is something that, you know, the expanded social package was supposed to be happen, could have addressed, but hasn't really come to fruition. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be considered in this relationship between the private sector players and their ability to provide really into the lowest end of the market. And it's a conversation that has been going on for a long time, but really does need to be pushed. And here's my little piece of activism, by the City of Joburg and by the MMC to think about how we address these issues and how we make sure that they do happen. So that's one thing. Going back to a conversation by Simon, you know, this question of, is it fair? Oh, it's so tough. So tough. But I can't help thinking, you know, the Olivia Road case, the San Jose case, happened in 2008. And was it fair that the city took another almost 10 years to respond to that? And it was only really within the last year that ICHIP has become city policy. Is that fair, to leave people in hiatus for that period of time? I don't know. And if we're talking about questions of justice, I think we have to think about the entirety of the question of justice. Not just, is it fair to the city, but is it fair to everybody in the city of Johannesburg?
Okay, we're going to open it for another round of questions. Please remember your numbers. It's 1, 2, I see at the back, 3, and 4. We have a revolving mic.
Should we go ahead? Okay, thanks. My name is Kevin Malunga, Deputy Public Protector, a familiar face for some. You know, people get excited a lot about Nkandla, state capture. Today it's Pravin. Last week it was Malusi, Gigaba, and so forth. That's the kind of work that people get, that we do, that people get excited about. But they don't know that 90% of the work that we do is actually in this space that you're talking about, in terms of service failure. Then probably if that other stuff is probably less than, we calculated, I think it's probably less than 3% of the work that we do. And I would even venture to say that the MMC got into power largely because of the frustration of people with the previous administration in areas such as housing. And I probably, the same thing happened in Nelson Mandela Bay, the same thing happened in Tshwane. And I don't know if there was an election today, MMC, would you be voted back? Given your current delivery over the past 6 months and of your principles. These are the challenges that we have a huge list of housing complaints, largely in the RDP space. And sometimes, or less so now, but the Johannesburg Social Housing Company, there was always complaints that your threshold is not pro-poor. So the question for me is, are you planning on extending that in terms of, because I know that there's that regulatory authority that you have in there. I think the lowest amount is 2,800. So it's people who still don't, who are still much better off. You know, your security guard, your domestics sometimes don't fall within that. So are you planning on extending that? And then, of course, secondly, based on some of the challenges that the state has as a whole, there's an investigation that I've been Deputy Private Protector for 6 years, and one investigation that I've wanted to do, and I think we probably may do it before I leave next year, is the issue of the state not knowing the property, the extent of its property. And that's not necessarily your problem directly, but there are people who are renting out state property, state land and so forth, that the state doesn't even know that, or sometimes they know, but a dodgy official some years ago gave them the right to do so. But do you know what you own as the City of Johannesburg? And the full extent and the housing, because why I'm asking this is sometimes you get some of your employees coming to us saying, but you know, there is property that, you know, we know so and so, but the problem is we're an evidence-based institution. So some of these investigations never get very far. So, and Nomzamo would know, we have interacted on some of these things. So, and lastly, your employees, are they properly housed? Do you have a housing, because you know someone can work for the city for 35 years, and it's very unfair for someone like that to go to a shack when they retire. How do you deal with things like that? I mean, I could spend the whole day with you, and if you spend the whole day with me, your blood pressure would probably shoot through the roof. But for now, this is what I'm just giving you for starters. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Mukwebo, not Sarah. I'm a student at WITS. I'm struggling with finishing off my master's in built environment, specializing in housing, because now I'm employed. So, you know, money sort of like takes precedence over studies. But anyway, so this is perhaps directed to you, MMC, as a state official, that there's been a lot of talks about housing, but also housing can never be mentioned without talking about mobility, you know, how the people are then going to be able to get around in the city. what I noticed when I stayed in Bram is that there's no, I don't know if I should call it a sync of some sort between the different transport systems that we have. And those transport systems are what the people that we're trying to create inclusionary housing for to be able to use to get to work. So a person can still stay in the city and say, for example, works in Rosebank, but they might have difficulty commuting from Johannesburg and getting to Rosebank or Sandton or wherever, you know. So is there anything that maybe from your department are trying to do in trying to also center all these other things that are related to housing when you talk about inclusionary housing? And I also wanted to talk about, there's this issue I have, and maybe you can take it up with provincial government, of calling Marlborough train station Marlborough. That thing is located in Alexander, and it needs to be called Alexander because what has actually done with it being called Marlborough is that it was done to allay the fears of the middle class and the upper class and white people and the likes. And with that happening, it has denied the people of Alexander an opportunity to actually benefit from that development or from that, from that project. Because, for example, look at what Sandton is doing with around the Gautrain station. Look at what Sandton is doing. Look at what Hatfield is doing. Look at what Pretoria is doing. But why can't we then afford the same opportunity for people in Alexander? You know, and then lastly, I haven't heard you say anything about student accommodation, and it's a crisis. Like, students can't afford accommodation in Johannesburg, we can't afford accommodation in Bram, we can't afford accommodation everywhere. And this also then plays into the issue of safety, that we are not safe as students anymore, more especially female students, because you don't have a place to stay. And what is the city doing about that? City of Johannesburg, for example, is housing 2 universities, but with a lot of campuses. What are you doing to provide accommodation in partnership with the universities for those students? Thank you.
Third question at the back.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Toby Ledlamini from the City of Joburg Planning Department. I don't have a question, more like a comment. Maybe just to look at the issue of the inner city, which is a burning issue. From our side as planning, as we've been working on the inclusionary housing policy, maybe it is important to acknowledge that our current proposals in the policy don't cater for the markets in the inner city per se, and it's something that we are considering looking at in the future is perhaps creating another layer of inclusionary housing that will look specifically at the inner city, taking into consideration how special it is. We recognize that we cannot treat it as we treat the broader area of Johannesburg. We cannot treat it as we have treated Sandton in the policy proposals. And to move on from that, in terms of, a lady had raised a question on why are we putting a burden on the private sector, burden for the lack of a better term. As the city, particularly planning and development, we are mandated to give development rights to private developers. And it is also our responsibility not just to give, but to try and leverage on that. Because when we give the development rights, we anticipate that the property prices in most cases do increase. So we need to tap into that, because as the state, we can no longer afford, we don't have enough funding to try and meet all their needs, especially in terms of housing. So that's one of the rationales for us to try and leverage on the rights that we have given the property developers. Thank you.
Thank you for that contribution. One last question before I take it back to the panelists.
Thank you. Sarah Charlton from Wits University. I just wanted to stick on this issue of trying to accommodate very poor people in well-located areas like the inner city, and the real difficulty of finding mechanisms to do that. And perhaps my question is specifically to Nomzamo, is what is the sort of policy position that you would put forward on that? So are you advocating a state-run rental program? So this issue of getting the state to subsidize cheap rental for poor people has been a big debating point in housing policy circles for a long time. And basically we don't have a mechanism to do that in the form of a rental subsidy currently. But I think it would be quite useful to know if that is if that's a kind of position that's being argued for, and is the position that the state can afford it, it should be doing it, and it has the competency to manage well-located subsidized rental.
MMC, I'm going to hand over to you. There were quite a few questions. I'm going to try to be a good facilitator, and if you need anything out, I'll just help you and prompt you.
Maybe I should start with the legal person. The issue of I don't know, will people vote you back? Obviously, you have the power to vote me back or not. And it's my role to convince you to vote for me, but I will not do it here. This is the wrong platform to actually do that. And I would have loved my legal people to be here, because on legal questions I will not be able to help you. Sorry. With regards to audits, we have embarked on audits because remember, we are 2 years in the administration, and there's a whole lot of challenges that we have within the city, where the questions, do you know how many buildings you have? Do you know how many houses you have? RDP houses have been occupied by illegal people. We have embarked, 2 months ago, we have embarked in a vigorous audit as an administration to make sure that we know the amount of houses we have, if houses are occupied by illegal people and so forth. So there is a preliminary report that has gone to the mayor a week ago. So this weekend they'll still continue doing their audits. With regards to the JOSCO and housing, we know there is a gap, and JOSCO, together with housing, a week ago has started discussions because we feel that the two departments are not really working closely together, and we need to work together to address the issues of housing. My heart is the poor people. It is also important to note this, that, and maybe I should add that we have houses that we allocated to residents in South Hills. There's a specific example in South Hills where you have RDP houses, then you have CRU units, and you have the bonded units on the same premises, which is a good example that the City of Johannesburg said. We are not there. We've not taken over the city to throw away the good that has happened. That is good. It's something that we built on. What is not good, we need to look at mechanisms to change it. We can't think the same way. We need to think differently. And some of the ideas that comes out here, it's something to think about and something to really deal with, and we acknowledge some of our failures. We acknowledge some of the weaknesses that we have, and we are willing to work on that. We will not throw that out. We will not completely say we can't talk to you. Talking about the evictions, and I'm so glad Sari mentioned this, that we've never evicted anybody currently. Is it Sari? Is that what you say? Yeah. So we've never evicted anybody because I know about the MBV building because that came up in a specific meeting. There are people in the building, and that building has been put up for tender. So that obviously will be reversed, because where are you going with those people? That has been in discussion. We have a specific department that deals with because we've got a challenge with temporary accommodation. So if those people are taken out of that building where you're taking them to. So you cannot really put them out because we will not have a place to put those people. So I can safely say to you that will not be in discussion currently, or it is not in discussion within the visible service delivery group. Is there any other question? Student accommodation, that's part of the program of the inner city. The development of those buildings within the inner city, student accommodation, low-cost housing, as well as SMMEs, they need to get an opportunity as well to be accommodated, because SMMEs are ignored. We need to give them they need to compete like the rest of the people. They can't be ignored in society because they play a crucial role in society.
I'll start with Sarah's question. So, Sarah, we are motivating for a state-run or public-run rental model because we do. Unfortunately, the market is here to make money, and because they can't make money out of the poor, the people who can only pay 700, 800 rand, then the state must step in. You are right to say there is currently no rental subsidy. And we are even engaging with the National Department of Human Settlement to develop such a subsidy. But also there is other things that we could be doing. So for instance, there's sweat equity that the residents of the industry are willing to put in. They're willing to be the security guards, to be the cleaners. We have the ESP, which is not working. So if you live in a building as 200 households, you can't register on the ESP against 1 meter number. So if the ESP, if people are able to access those services, then again you'd be able to cut down on what the cost is of the actual accommodation. But there's an issue that we currently have now is that because people are not able to contract directly with the city for services, some of that money is lost. There's a lot of lost revenue because people have to get their services only illegally. That money would be working towards some of these solutions. But even beyond that, there's a social cost, the health. I mean, if people live without sanitation, without water, you can imagine the burden that they are on the health system. So there's money that is being thrown away that we could be saving to bring about a solution that can work for everyone. And then I want to save the MMC because I want him to call me after this discussion. So in relation to student accommodation, that's been the one place the city has done something, because the buildings that where my clients used to live, Sarah, unfortunately, are currently occupied by students who are, of course, being charged a ridiculous amount, right? So there's an issue about exploitation. So the student accommodation is there, but it's not affordable. So here, the big buzzword has to be affordability, but also it has to be whoever is currently accommodated in the inner city must stay there with the services. So we hear the inclusionary housing policy, but the first thing we need to do now is go back and do an audit that says how many buildings don't have water, how many buildings don't have sanitation, how many buildings don't have electricity, and how do we give them those services immediately. I promise you, MMC is going to save your colleague in health a lot of money. It's going to save all your other colleagues a lot of money, and even in terms of the happiness of the citizenry in the city. Because I know in most of the buildings that my clients live in, I have neighbors who make calls to Joburg Water to disconnect their water because they say the water, there's no piping, so the water drips out. So please make sure they don't have water. So there is a lot of dissatisfaction that can be quelled by providing services to everyone in the inner city. But then two, let's talk about how we can expropriate these buildings and have them held in public hands. They can be run by NGOs. They can be run by the residents. Abosia, they're here. The Inner City Federation is doing a lot of good work in managing the buildings that they're already living in themselves. So there's opportunities for collaboration and partnership with residents, which can solve some of these problems. Thank you.
I'm going to do something which I also don't normally do, is also try and save the city a little bit as well. And that is...
See, you have comrades here.
Yeah, no. It's all politics. Anyway, but I mean, there was a conversation around, there was a question that came out about whether the city was going to look into more pro-poor kind of policy, whether it was going to be able to go low down in terms of its thresholds. And I think although that these are important questions, I'm not sure that these are necessarily questions that the city can respond to. I mean, one of the things that has continuously come up, which has been slightly problematic in terms of constitutional court judgments, and you'll see the connection in a minute, is that it's not necessarily the city's realm or mandate or constitutional obligation. National policy dictates some of those thresholds about where social housing sits who can sit in it, what the income groups are, that there's only a limited amount that the city can do to respond to those kinds of things. So I don't think it all sits with you, MMC, on this one. So I think we just need to consider also how the different spheres of government align and how their policy aligns in order to make these accommodations, and not just put the city on the hook, but to actually put the national and the provincial departments of human settlements on the hook as well. That's one comment. Second thing is to our colleague from city planning who was talking about the inclusionary housing policy. I think this is fantastic. I'm a big fan of the inclusionary housing policy, but I think it has to go further, as I said earlier. And I think we have to find all kinds of ways of really leveraging the value that people are making out of property. And I don't just think it should be in residential accommodation. I think we have to have a look at what's happening in terms of industrial developments, what's happening in terms of office parks. We need to think about inclusionary development rather than just inclusionary housing. So how do we make sure that the people who are making, and I think it's between 8 and 9.5% return on investment in both in the industrial sector and in the office park sector, how can we ensure that some of that profit goes into low-income communities as well? And the evening wouldn't be complete unless I took my colleague Siri on, and that is, I would be very concerned about the idea of the City of Joburg taking on any more property to run. The experience that we've seen in terms of evidence-based, from what our research and other research has shown, is that the city has not had great success in managing public housing stock. In fact, it's been, but it has been disastrous, and continues to be not very good. The idea of it taking on more stock, I think, is problematic. The temporary accommodation that has been provided in places like the moth building, for example, have also not been very successful. So the very idea that the city should take this on as a responsibility, I find problematic. I'm not saying it shouldn't intervene. I'm just saying that it should not necessarily be landlord, supplier, etc., of accommodation to very low-income people. That's where I'm at.
I'm going to ask the panelists just a few questions, and then I'll open it up again. I suppose, though, the very big question is, when you talk City of Johannesburg, it's easy to maybe really just focus on inner City of Johannesburg, but the metro is a lot bigger than that. And my question to you, MMC, other than talking about a more inclusive city, what are we going to do to really try to make residential areas, the area that we're in now, Houghton, whether it's Killarney, it's Rosebank, whatever other areas fall in the City of Johannesburg, beyond the inclusionary housing policy, but including that policy, what is really your vision for the future to make sure that we address spatial inequality, not only in a city, but also in the urban suburbs?
At this stage, one of the things that really disturbs is, as I said, people living in different areas. Because we were segregated, and we felt, or one of my visions is to create an inclusive community. And by doing so, the first thing that we are looking at is to look at accommodating people in different areas, right from the waiting list of the city. Because currently you have different people having different waiting lists. So if you have somebody from a waiting list that can be accommodated in Houghton, for instance, can be accommodated in Randburg, then you include different communities in a specific community. I remember I had a criticism of one colleague in the community where I live when I said that we want to include everybody, we want to create a community and not a segregated group. Then he said, you're just there now and you want to bring other people in the area where we live. So you've also got to cross those fears and alleviate those fears to begin to explain to people that we can no longer have a situation that we have now. We have to include everybody, and we're taking the waiting list, and people need to be accommodated as per that list so that they all have that opportunity to live in affluent areas and not just the poor areas.
I do have questions, but I see a lot from the audience, so let's rather go there. Can everyone's hands go up? Okay. So, Mom Emily, 1. Nice gray jacket. Number, was it tan jacket? Number 2. Number 3, denim shirt. Sorry, guys. I know you are more than what you wear, but just for just for simplicity. And then the gentleman in front with the orange shirt.
Thank you, Sumaya. Thanks for the opportunity. Even though I arrived late, you know, I come from the Bundus, though I'm a I used to be a Joburger. Thanks for the panel, even though I came late. I just have 2 questions, and it's a great concern. I think next time when we have such things, we should come earlier and then walk along the N1 to Bloemfontein, or along the Golden Highway, you know, from Zachariah Park, Vlakfontein, down, and then down Sebok, and the other side, they call it a Jovicho. And here they call it Pumulamkash, you know, rest. You are from, you know, being a subordinate or whatever you. What plans have you got? Now I'm jumping the wagon. What plans have you got to make it, to also align yourself with the new Urban Agenda 2030? Also looking at our NDP to help such communities, mushrooming of mikukus, informal settlements. The other day when I was there, they were shooting. People were not giving a notice that we are going to build a garage. You know, from Zachariah Park, it can be just 500 meters away. So there were the red ends. So what does this mean to our people? And every time come elections, just few months before the year ends to the elections, you'll see mushrooming of mikukus. This is because we are looking at getting the votes. And you forget that the power of X is more powerful than your power and authority. We elected you to be there, to assist us, to be our mouthpiece. So go down to the people, talk to the people, and come with a Mampara plan. When I say Mampara, it's provisional. Ne? Our goggles used to do 1, 2, 3, peg. 1, 2, 3, peg. 1, 2, it's a road. And then it's easy. You tell the person, don't put a mukuku there for infrastructure layout. And also, let's come up, it was there before, but I don't know where it went to. People's housing process, where in a row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, we start building your house, and I'm part of building my own house. Then you bring the inspector, NBHRC. Then I go to the next one. We go there, all of us, the 10. We build that house. Why can't we come with those plans? And look at what is happening also in the inner city. What about our Nyaupe boys here? They are waste pickers. They try to clean the town, but it's so dirty. Thank you for bringing that thing of safety and students. Let's talk about gender inclusive housing. Where we say, okay, our children, we have a building here, you have family units there. Our children, here is a park. And let's close Elof Street this side, and let's close Grace and this side and this side. We make a park, the gym, the oldies can come out, and they stay at the lower levels. And then up you take the young ones to stay there, young couples up there. So really, I say also, let's come up with serviced stands. You plot, you identify a big space there, piece of land. Then you start, okay, let's make proper planning. And then people can jump in, you allocate them correctly. And not go back, have a backlog everywhere. Look at the Cape Town, I'm just giving an example. We have an organization saying reclaiming the city. They went into that building. They spoke, you know, consultation, you know, we at the ground, we know how to approach and talk and do all those. Come again, we come tomorrow. You know, we are not impatient. And then they started to occupy that building. When they saw that they occupied that building, then Cape Town municipality went to cut the water, cut the electricity. They said, no, we are keen to pay. We said, we are talking to you. We want to give revenue, because there is no country that can be run without funds, without generating revenue.
Emily, I'm going to
Thank
have to
you.
stop you with a lot of love.
Promise to keep it short. Good evening. My name is Kelvin. I'm from Joint Aid Management. We work with ECDs in the city. We work with more than 800 ECDs in the city of Gauteng, or city of Joburg. Our biggest challenge is that they're providing a vital support as far as inclusive housing. But these angels and mamas that are running these ECDs are so limited because of the infrastructure problems, because of the building problems, because of the landlord problems, because of all these issues. They're providing a vital service. So when we talk about inclusive, we need to remember from cradle to grave. And there's some nice data in this report about the first 1,000 days. But if we're not going to respect the dignity of an unborn child, let alone the elderly, we're not going to win this fight. So we've really got to look at inclusive as far as all services, not just housing. But if you're going to provide housing, you've got to provide the support services to the residents in those homes, including safety, ECDs, the elderly, parks, and everything else. So we really need more debate about this, and we need stakeholders to support each other. We've got access to funding, but we can't implement because of the red tape and the bureaucracy and the problems. And that's a huge challenge, because we're throwing money away from donors, and we're not empowering these ladies who are micro-enterprise and creating jobs and providing a vital service for our residents and our people.
Thanks so much. Early child development is a passion of mine, so I hope we can speak afterwards. There are 2 more questions.
Greetings all. I'm Munyati Tabo, coming from the organization called FBA, Faculty of Best Advisory, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at WITS, so I'm coming from the students community. I would like to deviate a bit, but still relevant to the discussion. As I see the focal point, it's about the inner city. But we are forgetting one thing, which is the origin of the problem. As much as we still have a lot of people living under unfavorable conditions. But one thing that we are failing to capture is that these people, they don't necessarily originate from the city. They originate from other provinces, including myself, originating from the rural areas in the Eastern Free State called Qwaqwa, and then coming here for the betterment of my life. So, if we can start there, as the MMC, I think it is significant and it will be very instrumental that while you are planning for your city, engage with other MMCs from other cities, because you can come with strategies, with plans now how to combat the current situation of these unfavorable living conditions. But the influx of people will continue to come because you are not necessarily dealing with the origin of the problem. So I think it will be important that, as the professor earlier said, that if you have to compare Gauteng with Eastern Cape, Gauteng is better than Eastern Cape. Obvious people from Eastern Cape, their priority will be to find themselves in Gauteng to better their life, only to find out that they are only inviting the worst living scenarios as compared to where they were. But if you can start to engage with other MECs from other provinces, in that way you can be able to combat this problem. Just to conclude, like I said, I'm from the student community. To add on what Sarah has said about the safety and the expensive accommodations for students, this is a really, really great concept. Because what we now currently do, as we know, Wits University is located in Braamfontein, and the accommodation there, it's so expensive. So what we opt to do now is to cross Mandela Bridge and go to Newtown, downtown, and so, where the accommodation is lesser. However, that adds to the problem because now you have to include the transport money to get to the institution. If you don't have the transport money, it means you have to walk to your place. Look at myself. I'm a big man, I know that. But at some point, I was tried to, few street kids tried to rob me. This big man as I am. Just imagine if it was someone like my colleague here, what could have happened to her trying to reach to her place. So this is a very, very pressing issue about the expense of accommodation, because now it compromises our safety. So please, MMC, try to work around the student accommodation. That will save you a lot of problems. Thank you.
So I'm going to take this last question and then brief comments from the panel and close. The MMC is committing to having dinner with us downstairs, I'm hoping, so you'll be able to ask further follow-up questions there.
My name is Hassan Rafe. I'm a student at the University of Witwatersrand. I'm also doing a master's. Master's in Built Environment Housing. My special area is finance. And I think because of that, I need to start with the MMC and his comment on RTP housing. I'm certain, well, you've finished your probation, as Dada says, you need to go and find the white paper on Housing on 94, which to me was an eye-opener, that in the early days of sorting out housing in this country, we were looking at not inclusive housing, but participation housing, where people brought money into the situation. Like Mewa Siri says that people are willing to put in sweat equity. And sweat equity in some sort provides security. And, you know, when people talk about inclusive housing, I always have a problem with who's being included. Are we including business? Are we including government? Or the end user? I think the end user needs to include business and government more than government needs to include the end user. And I think that's what Emily speaks about. And Kanete Emily, how? Because you speak the things that I'm speaking about. It is people taking charge of their own lives. And it has always been a way to take charge of your own life. What we've got now are people sitting and waiting for government to do stuff for them. That is wrong. Tuntatwa Oxfam, you know, there's this story of expropriation. Let's understand expropriation very simply. If we're going to expropriate the site in Houghton, we are going to expropriate an RDP house in Diepsloot. You cannot have expropriation along a Calabar or an area bar. It is against the Constitution. So the site in Frankenwald, this one that you talk about, your vets, as Mayor's talking about, Mayor Sarah is talking about student accommodation. I've always said that site would be very good to build another campus for vets and student accommodation. And as Mayor Sarah talks about that railway station in Marlborough or Alexander, whichever way you want to look at it, it would be a nice way to have students be able to shuttle from there to vets. But my point and my passion about funding is that if people became involved in their own funding of their houses, my thesis is housing delivery, from free housing to financial participation and economic emancipation. If you are part of the process, you will get to where you're going. Dreaming is great. Action is better.
Thank you so much. MMC, I'm sure you know, I'm sure you got a sense of the richness of expertise in the room, and I hope you know, going forward, there's an opportunity for you to draw on some of them. So I'm going to start from Margot. If we can make our way to the MMC, if we could just answer some of the things that came and made some closing remarks. Thanks. And just to remind, we are going to be going downstairs, and we can engage further.
Okay, great. Cool. I think what I'm going to do, just as a closing remark, is kind of, what do they call it, squaring the circle, circling the square, I can't quite remember what it is. And actually take us back to the conversation we were having earlier about the NMI initiative and our report. And I think one of the things that's come up in this round of conversation has also been the importance not only of inclusivity in terms of residential inclusivity and including people from a range of backgrounds and whatever else, and student accommodation and whatnot, but also the question of how we create more inclusionary environments which are about SMMEs, which are about the fact that there are a whole range of services and economic activities and economic initiatives which need to be considered when we think about the idea of inclusivity. And here, and this is something that's come up and I'm so pleased it has, is this very idea of agency. And it is clear that if we look at the city, if we look at Johannesburg, there's enormous amounts of energy. People are doing things. They're not waiting. Okay? They are acting. And we see it in the basements in Hillbrow. We see it on the streets. We see it in the multiple stories in the inner city where people are utilizing spaces not only for residential things, but for creches and for coffee shops and for all kinds of different activities. And I think what we really need to consider as an inclusive city, as a space for everyone, is how do we support these activities? How do we not ensure that we don't criminalize them, and how do we regulate them in ways that make them safe for people, but at the same time ensure that we don't kill them as industries, as economies, and make sure that they are able to create the kind of economic opportunities and the kind of economic self-reliance that we're looking for. So I think the plea for me would be to say, if we're looking inclusive, let's think about how we do that. Let's think about how we talk about inclusionary zoning, inclusionary development, and it's about the whole gamut of urban activities, from residents all the way through to everything you can possibly think of a name. And I think that's the challenge I would put forward to ourselves as academics, as activists, and as the City of Johannesburg, is how we think through that and how we make it happen.
Thank you. So, I wanna start with Emily. I mean, I look at Katlehong, which 20 years ago, 25 years ago, was the same as a sprawling informal settlement, right? But what those communities had, they had security of tenure, and they've now built a proper township. So if informal settlements in this country were assured that where they are, they can build their homes, we'd have a much different situation. We'd have the contribution that you are speaking of. So people do want to invest, and even in some informal settlements, people do invest, even in circumstances of uncertainty. And it's really about government being supportive of those stances, and even the private sector. Sorry. The one thing that I think has been important, what has been said in this last one, which I think is very, very important, is that we must center, the people must be at the center, not on the outside. That even when we talk about the drafting of these policies, the inclusionary housing policy, you consulted SAPOA 4 times. Never once did you consult the residents of the inner city. And then they had to write their public comments. So you're saying the people in the inner city, they must see the government gazette and then write their views. When you think business, it's important for you to engage business in a room. I mean, and already that says you're not getting it. If you want to speak to Umama who's running a ECD center, you need to go and find her and say, have a hall in Hillbrow. And that's where she will engage with you. She's not going to engage with you via government gazette advert. So it is very, very important that in our ideas about inclusion, that we talk to the correct people. Not just, and even, I mean, not just the Nomzamos and the Magos, but the people who are actually living these realities. But I mean, I think this debate has taken us very far, and maybe I feel bad for having derailed it to be about the inner city. But I think we do have a lot of challenges in housing in general, and urbanization is a huge issue, my brother. So I think even if the MMC were to call the MMC of Buffalo City, where I'm from, it's not going to stop me from leaving Tanzania to come here, because the economic opportunities are here. So we need to be planning for urbanization. It's a reality that we can't run away from.
Well, thank you so much. I must say that this has been a very valuable debate. Good ideas that has come forth. I knew that the MMC is here. And everybody says, now I'm going to get the MMC. Yes. No, we're used to that. But Emily, I do admire you. You talk from an informed basis, and the colleague from UJ. I would want to invite colleagues in the room. Let us take hands with the City of Joburg. Let's make a Joburg that works. Because if Joburg works, then South Africa will work. It is one thing to criticize, it's another thing to jump in and assist us. So we value every input that we have, that we got. we value the positive criticism. We do not take that very personal. We've made a few notes, and we will work on these things. We definitely assure you we can make things work. But together, we can make Joburg work.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. I just need to mention something before we close. So we really, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we're thinking about how to engage with the Mandela Initiative report. And we really want to make sure it's about, how do we engage different people and younger people. So we have a relationship with the University of Pretoria, with the Department of Visual Arts, where we got information design students to, as part of the project for the year, to engage with some of the Mandela Initiative report content and to really put forward that information in a more attractive way, for lack of a better words. So we have the 3 winners from that downstairs, the posters downstairs for you to see. I know we have 2 students here tonight, Tim and Ilani, am I getting it right? Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for being here. And we'll see how we can make their visualizations more accessible to everyone. So thank you so much again. Just a quick word. I'm really happy that the MMC, it ended on a note that it's really about, a willingness on their side to involve more stakeholders. And then, we spoke about agency. It's about how can we as a citizenry also participate. I don't want to be cliched, but I'm going to end on a Madiba quote, only because I think it's relevant. And this is one of my favorite quotes. And he once said this to global leaders. So he said, "Do not look the other way. Do not hesitate. Recognize the world is hungry for action, not words. Act with courage and vision." And not only is that something that as NMF we're trying to do in our small, humble way, but it's really something that we're calling everyone to do tonight. Don't look the other way. Let's just really see how we can all participate. So please join us downstairs. I saw the reports have run out upstairs. I'm going to make more available downstairs for you. Thank you so much.